The Game Boy Advance continues to be a favorite of the channel, and who couldn't love this little thing? While a lot of people like the clamshell, and I certainly enjoyed that backlight, I'll always be partial to the original design. Ambronix even made an emulation handheld this past month that looks exactly like one. Sure, it couldn't hold a candle to the PS2 or original Xbox, but having what was essentially a portable Super Nintendo in your pocket was pretty dang cool. I've talked before about the challenge developers faced in bringing their 3D franchises to the small screen when I covered Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. But it was far from the only series to make the attempt. Crash Bandicoot also gave it a shot to middling results, and so we've arrived at today's game, Spyro Season of Ice. Developed by Digital Eclipse, the same company putting out retro compilations like Tetris Forever and The Making of Karateka, Season of Ice converts the breezy, gem-hunting collectathon to an isometric perspective. But did they actually pull it off? The story is told through still images, which is not unusual for a Game Boy Advance game, as Spyro and his extremely ugly friends hang out on the beach like it's an AU fanfic, when suddenly a fairy appears, well, a balloon appears, and begs Spyro to save her friends who have been trapped in ice by Grendor, a lowly Rhinoc that bungled some magic and wound up with 2 heads and needs the fairy's magic to fix it. Seems like you could just ask them instead of dunking them in ice like Boris from GoldenEye.
Yes! I am invincible!
So Spyro and his friends set out to rescue him, although I don't really know how Hunter's helping. He just seems to stand around in the hub world doing nothing. Yeah, I know how to glide, dude. Try hunting a job. Now, despite the title, Season of Ice isn't exactly set in a winter wonderland. It's actually got 4 different hub worlds themed to seasons, with autumn of all seasons being the opening area. The seasonal theming becomes even looser when you access the levels themselves. Like, why is the beach an autumn level, and why is a jungle canopy a winter level? Still, I highly appreciate the wide variety of level themes available in the game. Each level is set in its own themed environment with its own NPCs, who will have a couple of quests for you alongside more typical objectives like collecting all the gems and melting certain items down with your flame breath. All the typical Spyro moves are here, from charging, to gliding, to blasting enemies with fire. And the controls feel generally good, although I wouldn't say they're perfect. Season of Ice gives Spyro a pivot turn whenever you change direction, rather than snapping you. This was probably to try to give as similar of a feel to the 3D game as possible, but when you don't have analog control, it seems kinda pointless and instead gets in the way. You'll end up slipping off edges quite a few times because of that slow pivot turn, which can lead to some frustrating deaths. While a game over just boots you back to the hub world, it is a little annoying that melted objects reset on death, especially when they're spread so widely across each level. And speaking of level designs, these levels are pretty large, and it can be a bit hard to figure out just how large they are from this isometric perspective. It would have been nice to have a map, but instead, the select button brings up the atlas, which shows you your progress in each level, which is fine, but that can also be accessed from the start menu, so it's kind of an unnecessary shortcut. While you can use the L button to move the camera, it only extends to a slight distance from Spyro, making it not all that useful except for certain platforming-heavy stages, which gets into another gripe of mine. With a camera this close on the action, it feels criminal for a game to have levels with long-distance jumping. It's not every level, but levels like Hummingbird Forts rely on multiple leaps of faith, and there is no real way to tell if a platform in the distance is the same elevation, so get used to jumping and bonking into walls. Even if the original Spyro game had levels like this, it doesn't fit the perspective and ends up being really frustrating to navigate. The game is clearly at its best with more open field levels that have vertical climbs for platforming rather than deep distance gaps. All that being said, it's still plenty of fun to hunt down gems, cook enemies, and collect fairies, which replace the dragon collectibles in Season of Ice. In addition to finding them in the world, you'll also get them from NPCs for completing objectives. I'm not exactly sure why some of these people have fairies trapped in ice crystals just lying around. Did they see a frozen fairy with a horrified expression on their face and go, Sick, free fairy, I'll put that next to my Darth Maul Lego statue. There are also minigame levels that do a serviceable job of adding diversions to the gameplay. Each world has a level that gives you control over Spyro's sidekick Sparks, which kind of resembles Gauntlet, as you work to destroy enemy spawn camps and find keys to open each door to reach a boss. While I don't love these levels, they're fine enough, and being able to strafe with the R button makes them a lot more tolerable. The slightly odder duck is the flight level, trying to emulate those ring flight levels from the original games, but you obviously can't do that in 2D, so they opt for a Space Harrier style superscaler. You increase your time limit by shooting down yellow-colored enemies and hit blue or purple enemies to get gems. While these are also fine, I think it's weird that gems are missable here. If there's anything I dislike in collectathons, it's missable collectibles and auto-scrollers. They're already lengthy and heavily scripted, so having to redo them is pretty tedious. On top of that, you're required to play 2 separate difficulties of each flight level to get both fairies, so not my favorite. But I gotta say, these are way better minigames than the awful garbage in Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. This is nothing, Rare. You've wasted all our time. It's actually interesting to further compare Spyro to Banjo here, because there are ways in which both manage to outdo the other. While Spyro's aesthetic is more varied and interesting, Banjo does a solid job of recreating the look and feel of the N64 game. And while Banjo only has a few decently sized levels and kinda feels like a 90s shareware game, Spyro's got several levels per world and feels more full budget. But the transition to 2D hits differently for both games. Banjo's pre-rendered art style makes for handcrafted stages that feel more properly signposted, with areas of each level that look unique all their own, but Spyro's levels feel decidedly more tile-based, and each area of a level looks exactly the same as another as a result. I'm not saying it's a bad thing in a vacuum, but with Banjo I always knew where everything was. That also affects the gameplay, because finding 100% of the gems is just a lot harder when the camera is so close up, and the tiling is so samey. In the 3D games, Sparks could point in the direction of the nearest gem, but this feature is completely missing from Season of Ice. I also just think there's something a little missing when you can't spot gems in the deep distance like you can in a 3D game. But despite these problems, I still think Spyro Season of Ice is alright. It's a little more compromised than Grunty's Revenge, but it also feels like a fuller game, with lots of environments to explore and fairies to collect. 100 of them in fact, compared to Banjo's 60 jiggies. I also just flat out prefer Spyro to Banjo as a series. It's just more relaxing and, I don't know, whimsical? So while Grunty's Revenge might get a higher review score, Spyro is still the game I'd prefer to play. I just wish it was better. I wish levels had better signposting, that they removed some of the death pits, and could remove some of the friction and frustration that keeps me from getting into that same zen state as the original games. Thankfully, that all seems to be addressed in the follow-up game Season of Flame. But like that secret 4th episode of BBC's Sherlock, you'll just have to seek out my review of that game yourself. Maybe it's on some other YouTube channel right now. I may even be undercover with a completely different name. Before you go on that scavenger hunt though, thanks for watching this video. I'm just about recovered from that nasty winter cold and I'm back on my usual bullshit. I'll have new videos out every week for the foreseeable future, with a big Next Fest video coming in March. If you want to see videos early, you can sign up for my Patreon and check out other bonus content as well. This video was chosen by my backers, and I'll have a new poll up for February's Voters' Choice soon. Next week, hey, how about a change of pace? Let's talk about animation! I'll be talking about Gentry Chow versus the Underworld, a brand new cartoon Netflix unceremoniously snuck out last month. Until then, you'll find me in another castle.